This is Avdiivka. It is one of the suburbs of the large industrial city of Donetsk. After the so-called Donetsk People's Republic was formed in 2014 and the city of Donetsk itself came under Moscow's control, Avdiivka became one of the defense centers of Ukrainian army. In the 8 years that passed between the start of the hybrid war in 2014 and the full-scale attack on Ukraine in 2022, Avdiivka built such a strong defense line that despite daily attacks and bombardments for more than 13 months, Russia had not yet been able to capture the city. However, it seems that having learned from its mistakes, Russia had recently begun to use new military tactics. And now, Putin hopes that he will be able to capture Avdiivka, which could dramatically change the course of the entire war. This is Conflict Report. I live in Kiev and tell you about the war through the eyes of an eyewitness. So why Avdiivka is so important? The city is directly adjacent to the north of Donetsk. Before the war, the population here was about 35,000 people. Half of Avdiivka's territory is occupied by chemical and metallurgical plants, where the Ukrainian armed forces have organized their defensive fortifications. After the start of the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, Avdiivka defense successfully withstood the first feeble attempts at an assault. However, by the fall, Russian forces were still able to occupy the area to the southwest and northeast of the city. So early as 2022, this posed a threat to encircle Avdiivka, but it never materialized. The Russian army lacked manpower, though the Ukrainian army not only held most of its positions in the Donetsk region, but also launched counteroffensive in the Kherson and Kharkiv regions. But it wasn't the end. After mobilization at the end of 2022, the Russian army launched a new offensive. Freshly mobilized soldiers were attached as reinforcements to the old formations of the self-proclaimed republics, which had suffered heavy losses at the start of the war. Despite discontent among the soldiers and heavy losses in March, the Russian army managed to break through the fortifications northwest of Avdiivka and occupy the village of Krasnohorivka, which it had unsuccessfully stormed all of last year. The Russian army also captured the village of Novobakhmutivka, north of Krasnohorivka. And this could potentially allow Russia to avoid the mistakes it made in February in attacking another Ukrainian stronghold, Vuhledar. At Vuhledar, the Russian Pacific Fleet Marines were able to drive a narrow wedge toward the city. But on the flanks on this offensive, other units of the Eastern Military District were unable to break through the Ukrainian army defenses. The Marines were eventually squeezed from the flanks and halted the offensive. The capture of Novobakhmutivka in turn makes it possible to strengthen the flank of the group advancing from Krasnohorivka to the west. Russian and Western sources claimed that after capturing Krasnohorivka, the Russian army was able to completely cut off Avdiivka from the north from the main Ukrainian forces, although the Ukrainian side does not confirm this information. Nevertheless, that can be said for certain is that the Ukrainian army near Avdiivka has found itself in a serious crisis, although there is no immediate threat on their encirclement yet. Even if the enemy's breakthrough to the west of Krasnohorivka is confirmed, Russian troops will need to overcome a defense zone about 10 kilometers deep to completely encircle the Ukrainian grouping. By the standards of the Russian-Ukrainian war, where the advancing side often advances tens of meters a day, this is very much. But what is the goal of this Russian offensive, and how might the city change the fate of the war? Russia's plan A is the capture of Avdiivka's fortified area, which could be a prologue for a Russian offensive on the entire front. This does not yet seem like a realistic prospect. Plan B is to draw back Ukrainian reserves. The Russian offensive, which began in January, is being conducted as a series of unrelated operations in various directions. This approach has obvious disadvantages. Russian forces lacked the strength to make a decisive breakthrough anywhere. But there is also a silver lining to this kind of action. Even local crises in different directions force the enemy to constantly shift reserves. Ukraine already moved about 10,000 men to Bakhmut in March. Also in January and February, the Ukrainian command had to redeploy forces to Vuhledar in order to stop the Russian offensive on that city as well. Now, the command of Ukrainian army has to decide how many reserves to throw to repel the attack on Avdiivka. The defenders cannot simply leave the town. Unlike Bakhmut, behind which there is a convenient second line of defense, the northern suburb of Donetsk is the cornerstone of the entire Ukrainian front in the Donetsk region. Perhaps the Russian command hopes that the defenders' reserves here have already been exhausted, and Ukraine will have to tap the reserves that were planned for a counterattack. In any case, Ukraine faces very unfavorable circumstances during the defense of Avdiivka. First, as in Bakhmut in recent months, Avdiivka is semi-surrounded, which means the supply of ammunition, artillery and air defense equipment is extremely difficult. The group defending the city simply has no normal safe rear area. In addition, Russia used a new tactic in its attack on the city. Avdiivka and the surrounding area have been subjected to systematic daily aerial bombardment for several weeks. Thus, this was the first area of the year where Russian aviation was able to conduct systematic strikes. This immediately demonstrated the danger of Russian air supremacy to Ukraine. The city was rapidly deteriorating. The supply of forces to positions was becoming increasingly difficult. But how did the Russian Air Force manage to resume its strikes? And why was it not possible before? At the beginning of the invasion, Russia tried but failed to completely suppress the Ukrainian air defense. The Russian command miscalculated by assigning too many tasks to its air force, from strikes on Ukrainian communications and military-industrial facilities to direct support on the advancing troops. As a result, at the beginning of March 2022, Russian aviation attempted to hit targets deep within the Ukrainian defense and lost more than 10 aircraft in a few days. After that, the activity of the Russian Air Force quickly came to a halt. Most of Russia's aviation are now hardly involved in strikes missions. Last time aviation was actively used during the storming of Mariupol, where Ukrainian forces were surrounded and quickly lost air defense systems there. But all of the above applies to the Russian Air Force. Army helicopters and attack aircraft, on the other hand, continue to perform tasks in direct support of the troops. The difficulty is that helicopters, due to the lack of high-precision ammunition, now attack mostly with unguided missiles, and are also forced to fly at low altitudes to avoid man-portable anti-aircraft missile systems. This greatly complicates missions and reduces the effectiveness of aviation. Since October, when General Sergei Surovikin was appointed to lead the so-called special operation, the Russian army began a long campaign aimed at returning the initiative to Russian aviation. Surovikin staged a strategic bombing campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Its main purpose was to weaken the enemy's air defense. Previously, Ukraine air defense used the tactic of waiting. The systems were guided by reconnaissance data, waited for Russian aircraft with radars turned off, and turned on only when the enemy approached the front line. This tactic inflicted maximum losses on the Russian aircraft and allowed Ukraine to avoid its own losses. After the bombing of the energy infrastructure began, Ukraine was forced to pull back a large part of its air defense from the front line to use it to cover the power plants. In addition, it had to spend scarce ammunition not at the front but at a distance from it. In such a situation, the Ukrainian army could not effectively cover both strategic facilities inside the country and the front line at once. Allies, realizing the complexity of the situation, began to increase supplies to air defense systems to Ukraine. However, NATO countries themselves do not possess large stocks of them and have also exhausted their stocks of missiles for the Soviet systems, which Ukraine badly needs. Russian commanders are confident that they can deplete Ukraine's air defense faster than the West can replenish it. Avdiivka has become the main testing ground for this Russia's new tactic. Because the city is semi-enclosed and has no safe rear, it is very difficult for Ukraine to defend it with air defense systems, as it cannot bring them close to the front. Allies and Kiev see the threat posed by Russian aircraft. NATO is threatening Ukraine's air defense system, and Eastern European countries are giving it aircraft, although so far only Soviet-made. However, it is likely that the alliance will also have to hand over Western-made aircraft to Kyiv, although many NATO politicians believe this could lead to too much and little predictable escalation in the conflict with the Kremlin. So far, Western countries have directly refused such deliveries to Ukraine, although they have not ruled them out in the future. And that's why Avdiivka is so important. If Russia's new plan works, it could dramatically change the balance of power on the front line. And that's all for today. In the next video I will discuss how Ukraine and Poland are planning to create a new superunion to defend against Russia. So subscribe to the channel not to miss anything. And you can also support the channel via Patreon or join button below this video. This was Conflict Report. Live in peace.